It's a whole year since Hellbent first aired. Watch on to find out why I love it so much. So here we are, the last review of the series, and if I'm perfectly honest, it's one that I've been wanting to do for a very long time. I haven't always loved Hellbent. When I first watched it on my first watch, it didn't quite sit well with me, but after multiple rewatches and lots of thinking about it, the plot, the creative choices in the writing, I think I now appreciate it a lot more for what it is. And to finish off defending Series 9 today, I'd like to kind of share some of that with you, because this is where it's all been heading. Hellbent is one of the most controversial episodes of Doctor Who, let alone Series 9. We have already had Sleep No More, but I think there's a wider range of opinions on that one. You can either completely love it, completely hate it, or be somewhere in between, you know. It's not perfect, but I like the concept of the found footage. But with Hellbent, you really do either love it or you hate it. There are people like me that completely get it, and there are other people, and it's their worst nightmare, with Clara back, with not enough time on Gallifrey, allegedly, and the hybrid story arc. And they're the three main things I'm going to focus on in this review, because they are the main criticisms, and I personally think they're completely unnecessary. So wish me luck as I begin to defend Hellbent. Now I'm first going to cover Gallifrey, and I'm going to be perfectly honest here. On this rewatch, I thought Gallifrey and the Time Lords were actually used fairly well. It's not until about halfway through the story that the Doctor leaves Gallifrey in the stolen TARDIS and the plot moves elsewhere, as in more of a focus on Clara and the hybrid, and with the Shield coming into play as well. I think there is a fundamental problem with Gallifrey in that because it barely ever appears in the show, but it's such a big part of the canon, the mythology, it will always be inconsistent from story to story, and different writers are always going to have their different takes on it. So it's always going to be inconsistent. I think that's a fundamental issue there. But what's more is that I don't really believe that Gallifrey has ever been used too well. That's because, partially, like some people say of the Time War, all the magic and mystery of Gallifrey is lost when it's actually seen on screen, when we actually go there. It's kind of like, you know, oh yeah, here's Gallifrey, but what happens next? What are we going to do? And I think actually Gallifrey doesn't have much going for it, apart from the fact that it's the Doctor's home planet. And we've got Rassilon, who is a bit meh, and I'll talk a bit more about him later. But there are other Time Lords, I suppose, minor recurring characters from the classic series. There's the Master as well, Missy. But really, I don't think there's a whole lot you can do on Gallifrey in a Gallifrey story. But just going back to that point about inconsistencies, take Barusa in the classic series, for example. He's played by a different actor in every single story he's in. I'm not sure why, it's not something I've researched, not something I know, but I think there are 4 stories he appears in, and there's a different actor in each one of them, so 4 different incarnations. You know, if that's not inconsistent, what is? There's also Rassilon, the prime example for me. He was such a mystical and powerful, unknown character in the classic series. In the new series, there does seem to be an awkward trend that involves manifesting Rassilon as every single Lord President character we've ever met. Despite this, however, Rassilon is barely ever named on screen. Take The End of Time, for example, when he's called the narrator in the credits. And it's only really in part 2, when he's facing the Doctor, that he's actually referred to as Rassilon. And again in Hellbent, it's not clear to start with whether this is just a generic Time Lord President or Rassilon himself, although the gauntlet kind of gives it away. But I think the reason he's not named on screen that much is just because of all this convoluted continuity, and it probably puts off casual viewers, really. I mean, with the best will in the world, why do we actually need every single Lord President to be Rassilon? He appeared, well, he didn't even appear physically in the classic series, he was just there as a godlike type figure, you know, in the 5 Doctors. So why is it that they're kind of so obsessed with him? I don't know, but I think Rassilon is a good example of what I'm talking about here with Gallifrey. I think sometimes the writers perhaps just don't know what to do with Gallifrey because of what Gallifrey is and what it means for the show and all the elements and all the continuity. So I think that's a fundamental problem and not one that's exclusive to Hellbent, really. But like I say, I think the Time Lords and Gallifrey are actually used quite well in the story. And I think also the way that Stephen Moffat handles this problem is quite unique and quite special, because instead of getting too bogged down by the continuity, instead of looking back too much, in this post-Time War age for Gallifrey, he's kind of introducing this new age, creating a new era for the Time Lords, and the whole invention of the hybrid prophecy enables Gallifrey to move forward, really. I mean, yes, I know the prophecy is a bit generic, and it's hard to believe that that was part of the reason why the Doctor left Gallifrey all those years ago, but at the same time, you've got to respect Stephen Moffat for putting it in there, taking the risk, and doing something new, instead of just repeating the same old tricks, same old types of story. He does something different here, and that's part of the reason why I like the hybrid so much, even though it's not too convincing at times. But overall, I think it just about works. I've got a side note here on my notes about the General and the Doctor's decision to shoot him. Firstly, I do agree that it's a mistake, but only because of the Doctor's mindset at that point. Anyone who thinks it's unjustified, however, needs to rewatch the scene. The General, acting as a sort of moral compass for the Doctor, makes it very clear that he cannot leave the extraction chamber without returning Clara to her death. And rewatching, he's very adamant about that. You know, he's not going to let the Doctor take her away without putting up a fight. Well, I do say that. I mean, the Doctor steals his gun, partially to stop him from using it on him, because I think the Doctor ignorantly thinks the General might shoot him, because he's just another military Time Lord. But actually, I think the character of the General is better than this. You know, he stands up to Rassilon, and I personally doubt that he would have ever used firearms against the Doctor, being so sensible, really. But in the heat of the moment, clearly the Doctor thinks he doesn't really stand much of a chance, and even if the General isn't going to shoot him, you know, that there's going to be trouble if he runs off with Clara without taking some sort of precaution. So that is why he shoots him, and it's as simple as that. There's really nothing else to it. Yes, it's out of character, I completely agree, but that's because by this point the Doctor is not the Doctor. He's a monster, he's the hybrid. He's broken every rule he's ever lived by, and this is one of the consequences. Now on to Clara. Now, instinctively, I do actually agree with the decision to bring her back, and I always have, really. Having thought long and hard about this, I've come to the conclusion that the reason I have is simply that it's a more upbeat and uplifting, hopeful end for her character and for the series. It works better for Doctor Who. My school is currently doing a production of Les Mis, and in Les Mis, for those of you that know it, there's, at the very end, in the epilogue, there's a wedding scene, and then when all the characters come back and sing together, all the characters that have died, and when I first watched this at the West End, particularly the wedding scene, the upbeat nature of that, with all the dancing and kind of comedy elements, I wasn't too convinced. But actually seeing it at my school has forced me to wonder, why was it put in there? Why is it like that? And I think it's the same reason that Clara goes off in TARDIS in Hellbent. It's because having that wedding and that visual scene at the end, even though it is moving, having, you know, all those ghosts and characters back, it emphasises the hope and the positivity instead of ending it with the barricade or something dark like that. And to be honest, ending with Clara's death just could never have worked, really. I mean, some people say, oh, we forget about Hellbent, we just imagine the series ended at Face the Raven or Heaven Sent. But I don't get that. I can't see that, because the Doctor is so angry by that point that he's going to be driven right to the extreme. He's going to take revenge on the Time Lords, and clearly at some point he's going to be forced to stop or made to think, and, you know, think, what have I done? And something else is going to happen. Something else has got to happen there. I mean, I am kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but when I say that, I mean that the hybrid of Clara and the Doctor, you've got to think of it like this. They both contribute to the hybrid. It's one metaphorical thing, it's not physical. But they both contribute to it, and I think they both contribute equally to it, you know. And Clara dies, so that's kind of half of the problem solved. She's suffered. But there's still the Doctor. The Doctor has to suffer, and that is why, structurally, the Doctor has to lose his memory of Clara. Something has to happen, and he has to actually back down. And only then is the whole incarnation of the hybrid complete, and it's all been dealt with, and we can move on to new adventures in Series 10. Again, re-emphasising my point, what you have to remember is that despite how tempting it may be to assume, when Stephen Moffat was planning the series and writing the series, he didn't just tack on Hellbent on the end. clearly in the grand scheme of things, Moffat never actually intended Face the Raven to be Clara's true end. Now you could argue, oh, Sarah Dollard, she was the one that wrote that well, she did a brilliant job with that. But no, clearly Moffat had a say. Moffat made that story Clara's death, in inverted commas. Well, it kind of is her death. It still is her ending, her definitive ending. But there was always a plan to extend it and explore her character and her story more, one last time, in the very final episode of the series. Now I know some feel that the whole resurrection of Clara and flying off in the TARDIS with the Shilder, it completely undermines her death. And yeah, I can sort of see that, I will admit. But I would argue that a simple death for Clara Oswald doesn't do the character justice. After spending an entire series and a half becoming more Doctor-like, after splintering herself across his time stream, after all she has done, I think not only does she deserve better as a character, there's got to be more. It's got to end a different way. Because she isn't just your average human. Even though she is fundamentally, physically human, she is so much more Doctor-like. And yes, she is more breakable than him. Yes, she can die just like any other human. But I think because of what Clara has done and the impact she's had on the Doctor's life, whether you like that or not, having her fly away in the TARDIS is a more fitting end. Having her become more Doctor-like, as she'd always wanted. Of course, like I've said many times, she still dies there on Trap Street. But it's that kind of idea, a bit like with the Sarah Jane Adventures, the story goes on forever. It's that kind of feeling. Yes, we know that Elizabeth Sladen has died, and that means at some point in the future, Sarah Jane Smith dies. But it's not something we dwell on or talk about. Instead, there's the idea of the story going on forever, and it's a much more uplifting, hopeful message to end the series on. Now, having said all of that, if you disliked Clara as a character generally, or just simply felt that her death in Face the Raven had more impact and was better, then I respect your opinion, that's absolutely fine, and I can see why Hellbent must seem like such a disappointment to you, if that was your mindset. Now this leads me on to my final point, the hybrid. It is one of the most controversial series story arcs of the revived series, if not the most controversial. However, I personally think it's one of the strongest. As I read in a DWM review of Hellbent when it first came out a year ago, it's not an arc that relies on tacking a phrase, idea, or cameo character appearance onto each episode of the series, like, with Bad Wolf just plonked into an episode, or Missy suddenly appearing, or Madame Kavarian opening her door. It's not jarring like that. I think it flows much better in the grand scheme of the series, because it's much more subconscious and thematic than your average story arc, the ones I just suggested. I mean, take Series 8's arc and the whole revelation of Missy being the Master. Not only is this more accessible and easy to understand for the viewer, but the whole thing about Missy being the Master, it's an answer to a series-long question that we've been teased throughout the whole of the series, 10, 11 episodes. And that answer can either satisfy you or not. It's something you can either agree with or disagree with. Nevertheless, her appearances throughout the series give you a pretty good idea of what's to come in the finale, and the week gap between Dark Water and Death in Heaven gives you a chance to come to terms with this revelation, and it kind of warps and shapes your expectations of Death in Heaven, giving you a pretty good idea of what's going to happen, what you're going to get, meaning the actual episode matches that vision relatively well. Now, on the other hand, we have the hybrid. In a way, it's a much more open arc, because it isn't as obvious where it's going. In many ways, it's about being presented with different potential options and fulfillment of the whole prophecy thing throughout the series, such as Davros attempting to make Time Lord Daleks, but ultimately failing. So as I mentioned right back at the start of the series, why did we ever believe that we'd be seeing an actual graphic, physical Time Lord Dalek hybrid in the finale? That concept was over and done with. It was one option, and it was ticked off, tried and tested. We have other ones along the way, like Ishilda and Osgood. It's been a part of the Doctor's life since he discovered it in the Matrix before leaving Gallifrey, but only now starts to become more relevant, which is the kind of excuse that I used for it not being mentioned before this point. And that's why he's so obsessed with branding so many different possibilities hybrids throughout the series, such as Ishilda or Osgood, even if they're not physical hybrids, or even remotely like a hybrid. He's in that mindset, he's kind of anticipating something, anticipating having some part to play in the creation of the hybrid, very soon in his life. So these aren't so much red herrings, but signs that there's a bigger hybrid to come, building to the finale. So by the finale, we know very little about what the creature will be, do, or look like. With us learning little more about it in the penultimate story of the series, Hellbent has a lot to answer for. This leads to a dangerous amount of elaborate speculation in my eyes as to what the hybrid and its plot might actually be, by people who have clearly missed the whole point of the series arc. It's the Doctor and Clara, a pairing that would go to complete extremes for each other. That's the reason why they have to be separated, like I talked about earlier on. But of course, because it's such an open arc, and we're never really told 100% what the hybrid is on screen, or in the lead up, it sort of invites people to make up their own interpretations and ideas, and in a way, therefore has nothing to blame but itself when those expectations don't meet reality. It's part of the risk of doing something less obvious, more based around themes, and, that kind of subconscious thing working away in the back of your head. There's a danger there of you either getting it or not getting it, and yeah, that's a risk, but I think for such a beautifully crafted arc, it's a risk that Moffat and the team were quite rightly very willing to take. And I think the actual end product is a very intellectually stimulating story arc, and I'm fine with that. However, as I say, I can see why that might irritate some people. The hybrid is a prophecy though, so unless that crazy seer woman from the end of time was to pop up again, the one that kept tapping her fingernails on the table, I wasn't really expecting a concrete resolution myself. I mean, come on, it's a prophecy. Only gods, in inverted commas, can answer them for certain. We do see it fulfilled, in a literal sense, but because no character has the power to point out that this is exactly what was meant by the Matrix all those years ago, it still seems open. I have one more thing to say about the hybrid, one final thing. In Heaven Sent, the Doctor claims to have information about the hybrid. In reality, all he knows for certain, I think, is that he will have some part to play in its creation. I believe he claims to know more, purely to retain and increase his value in the eyes of the Time Lords. However, there's also something else going on here. By the end of the episode, he's certain that the hybrid is him, i.e., the hybrid is me. Now this could just be a shoulder, but in this context, for me, that just doesn't work. He's supposedly using wordplay to talk to himself. Now why would he do that? Why would he joke around with himself when he's not actually talking to anybody? There's nobody actually there for him to talk to. It's as if he's talking to Clara. If he has an audience, a person that will get the joke, the ambiguity of it, and therefore be puzzled by it. But there's nobody for the Doctor to puzzle here. There's no audience. Nobody is actually listening in reality, even though he's supposedly talking generally to the Time Lords. Therefore, I propose that by the end of his time in the Confession Dial, the Doctor has ended up convincing himself that he is the hybrid, or at least will be. It's a bold statement and could have a hidden meaning with the possibly human Time Lord undertones, but that's a completely different matter. Having said this though, his first suggestion to Ashilda is the hybrid is me, i.e. her, but that's after he's gone too far, and once he has an audience. At the end of Heaven Sent, he's alone and angry, so therefore, I think trying to convince himself that he is the hybrid, as opposed to admitting it, as if he's known all along, which he quite clearly hasn't. And by the time he's gone too far, the more plausible option is Ashilda, and also by that point, the Doctor doesn't really want to be recognised as the hybrid. He knows very well, I think, that he could have fulfilled that prophecy, or it's at least him and Clara. He's got some vague idea, but he doesn't admit to it. He blames Ashilda instead, which I think is quite interesting. So that is officially it. To sum up, that is basically why I like Hellbent, why I think it works, and Series 9 does as a whole in terms of the story arc. Like I say, the hybrid arc is very open and ambiguous, both in its exploration in the main body of the series itself, and even more so in its resolution in the finale, so I admit it's much more controversial and open to interpretation. But this is my interpretation, one that is based strongly on what I believe to be Stephen Moffat's original own intentions, having researched these and thought about them meticulously. I really do hope you enjoyed Defending Series 9, and I'd love to hear what you thought of it below, and your overall thoughts on Hellbent and Series 9. I'd also really appreciate you telling me if any of these videos have made you change your mind about any of the series' 12 episodes or its story arc. Of course, no opinion is wrong, and everyone is entitled to one. I'm not trying to tell you I'm wrong, just give my side of the story, put out the case for Series 9. There are quite a lot of you probably who would disagree and put a case in against Series 9, But if so, you know, comment them below, we can have a debate about them, a civilised argument, and that should be really interesting to discuss these ideas in these episodes. But like I say, what I have created here is an attempt to defend the definitive intentions of Moffat, and what the series is actually meant to be about, from a fan that believes he gets it. Someone tweeted me about this when I was tweeting about Hellbent on Twitter. I literally did hundreds of tweets about it the morning I watched it, and there were some very interesting arguments and things that people had to say in response to my comments. But there was one very interesting one that sticks out to me, and that is, it's something along the lines of, too many people judge Hellbent for what it isn't, and not what it actually is. And I think that's the key to understanding and enjoying it. You have to look at what it is, why it's like that, because clearly the series, Hellbent, the structure of it all, is like that for a reason. And when you look at it that way, it begins to make more sense. It's been great fun to do this series, guys. I really hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the future for more videos. My next one that I've got planned is an overall review of Class, because doing this series hasn't really given me a chance to discuss individual episodes of Class as they air, so I'm really looking forward to doing an overall overview, series review type video, looking at the series as a whole and what I thought of it. I also plan to do more top 10s in the future, and I'll probably end up reviewing Doctor Who's Christmas special this year, The Return of Dr. Mysterio. So do stick around, guys, and subscribe if you haven't already. But until then, bye for now.